I interviewed over 100 mothers who relinquished immigrants for adoption. And I always ask them, like, what stories do you see about adoption that you feel strongly about? And they all, like, uniformly hated Juno.
Interesting.
Right.
Welcome to Rom-Com Bomb, a sex ed with DB podcast series where in every episode we go under the covers with a beloved rom-com, strip away its hidden toxic messages, and rewrite the script on love and sex. If you've been wanting more intentional time with your partner but don't want the hassle of spending a lot of money for a fancy date night, look no further. Aria has you covered. Aria is a service for couples that makes it easy to break out of routine, deepen emotional connection, and energize their relationship with curated experiences called scenes. I recently did one called Heat, and I could not recommend it enough. Prioritizing intimacy with your partner is essential, and Aria makes it easy. Visit arya.fyi and use code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off now. I'm about to get personal here, so listen up. I'm going to tell you a fun fact about me that you definitely didn't know. The lube that I use most consistently is Uberlube. I really mean it. If you were here with me right now, I'd tell you to go over to my nightstand drawer and tell me what you see. That's right, you would see a bottle of Uberlube. If you've never heard of Uberlube, let me tell you about it. Uberlube is a silky smooth silicone-based lube recommended by leading doctors, and its body-friendly ingredient list makes it widely used by people with sensitivities to lubricants. Another amazing thing about Uberlube is that it doesn't leave a sticky residue like water-based lubes do. It lasts for a long time and doesn't stain clothing or bedding. I have 3 bottles of Uberlube on my bedside table right now, ready when I need it. If you're someone who wants to feel more pleasure in the bedroom, use code SEXEDWITHDB for 10% off at uberlube.com.
Are you tired of waiting for sparks to fly on your dating app? Do you dream of running through airports to deliver an out-of-breath, unplanned monologue? Then stop doom scrolling and start listening to Meet Cute Rom-Coms. Feel-good love stories that take you from chance encounter to grand romantic gesture in just 15 minutes. We're bringing rom-coms back. Get a brand new Meet Cute series on the first Tuesday of every month, with new episodes twice a week. Fall in love with Meet Cute Rom-Coms, wherever you find your podcasts.
Is this where we kiss?
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Rom-Com Bomb. I'm your host, DB, sex educator, pleasure expert, and rom-com critic. Today, we are so lucky to have Dr. Gretchen Sisson with us. She's a sociologist studying abortion and adoption at UCSF and the author of Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. Her work has been cited in the Supreme Court dissent for Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, and she's written extensively about the realities of adoption in the U.S. We couldn't think of a better guest to help us dive into today's film, which you'll learn about in a second. One of the most popular and influential portrayals of adoption in pop culture thus far. Gretchen, we're so excited to have you on Rom-Com Bomb. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thrilled that you're here. Can't wait to get into it with an expert. And here's the trivia teaser from last week. This 2007 indie darling was written in just 6 weeks at Minnesota coffee shops, and it launched the career of an Oscar-nominated screenwriter and forever changed how we think about orange Tic Tacs. Drum roll. Today we're reviewing Juno. Gretchen, how do you feel? Are you excited that we're reviewing this movie today?
I'm actually really excited to talk about this movie. I have been thinking and overthinking this film since it came out. So I'm really excited to get into it.
Ooh, I love the phrase thinking and overthinking. So I'm sure we're going to hear all of the details about that. But before we dive into Juno, can you just tell us like a little bit about your work? Like what got you interested in studying adoption? What inspired you to write your book, Relinquished? I'm just curious to hear all of it.
Yeah. So I started studying adoption when I was working at an organization in Boston called the Alliance on Teen Pregnancy. So most of our work at the Alliance was really about supporting pregnant and parenting young people, not unlike Juno, and figuring out how to help them in their advocacy for what they needed to successfully raise their families and move towards self-sufficiency. And this was soon after, which is a few years after Juno had come out, but it was also right around the time that 16 and Pregnant came out on MTV
Oh,
and
wow. I
started
used to love that show.
premiering. Yeah, yeah. And a lot of the young mothers that I worked with, we watched the show pretty religiously to see the stories that were being told about their lives as young mothers. And on that first season, Caitlin and Tyler were a couple who became pregnant in high school and relinquished their daughter for adoption. And the narrative around Caitlin and Tyler's story was very much that they were more mature, they were better parents for having given up their daughter, that this sacrifice actually made them that more worthy in a way than their counterparts who were working really hard to raise their kids. And I was really interested in that. And I was at the time volunteering at an abortion fund. I had just written my master's thesis on infertility and assisted reproductive technologies, which I'm sure will come up in our Juno discussion as well.
I am sure they will. Yes.
And yeah, and I think that I kept kind of coming across adoption as this like political, rhetorical solution, right? People don't need access to abortion if adoption exists. We don't need to support young families or vulnerable families if they should just be giving up their children. Why are people pursuing infertility treatments if they should just be adopting? And I really I wasn't seeing that any of these understandings of adoption were actually reflective of what people's experiences with adoption were, what they look like. And so I wanted to examine that more deeply and started doing my own research on the experiences of mothers who have relinquished infants for private adoption. That was in 2010. I continued that data collection, and then I went back and re-interviewed a lot of the same mothers in 2020.
Wow.
So that's really the core of the book.
Wow. I'm so excited to get more into this. Folks, if you're interested in this as much as I am, which is a whole lot, tune into Friday's bonus episode to hear what Gretchen has to say about all of her research and what she's learned from doing this for so many years. And so stay tuned for that.
I also just wanted to add, in addition to my research on adoption, I've done a lot of work looking at the ways that we tell stories about abortion in our popular culture and in our films. And so this is actually my first time getting to talk about Juno, about what it really is, which is a story about adoption, because I have really overanalyze that scene of her in the abortion clinic as well, which I think is an important part of her story about how she's making a decision about her pregnancy and what to do. So I've talked about that particular scene and her decision around abortion a good amount. So I'm excited to get into the adoption story as well.
Yes. Oh my gosh. There's so much good content in this film. And yeah, just in case it's been a minute since you've watched it, listener, here's a quick refresh. Juno follows a 16-year-old played by Elliot Page who gets pregnant and decides to place her baby for adoption. She chooses Vanessa and Mark, played by Jennifer Garner and Jason Bateman, a wealthy couple who seem perfect until cracks start to show. So it's kind of this like indie comedy, dramedy. And yeah, I'm wondering like what comes up for you. We have a segment called As a Kid, where like if you could share any kind of like personal histories with the movie, like any nostalgic attachment, like before the rewatch, what kind of came up for you when you like first saw this movie?
Well, I think that it's a very charming movie, and I'm watching it with a really critical eye right now. And there are still so many moments that I like, kind of in spite of myself.
Yes.
You have this kind of quirky heroine. You have like an incredible cast, Elliot Page, right? You have Allison Janney playing her stepmom, who's this
Epic.
like badass, funny, supportive character that I really enjoy. And there are a lot of very charming moments about it, and there still are. I have, as we'll get into, a lot of really critical things to say, but I understand the appeal of this film still. And I think that was what made it endearing for a lot of audiences when it first came out. It was kind of this sleeper hit. It was this lower budget indie film that was written quickly and filmed quickly and kind of, I think, got this like niche feminist following in a way. And some of those things still hold true, I think.
Completely agree. Yeah. banging cast. I was 15 when this movie came out, so it was kind of perfect for me to like kind of put myself in the shoes of Juno or like one of her friends, or just feel like it, it was just very, very funny and still is. And I like how snarky she is, and very smart, and like kind of how she wants to be more mature than her age. And she kind of is in control, like in a lot of ways in this film. And I really admired that about the writing. Um, and yeah, like Rainn Wilson, like at the height of his office stardom, just kind of like is in the
Like,
is the market dude.
had no business doing this like 2-minute scene at the like this
Right,
guy was super recognizable at this time.
right,
And to just be the like convenience store checkout clerk with
right.
like some of the most hilarious lines in the film right
Totally.
off the bat was fun to see him in that.
It's just so classic mid-aughts quirky comedy where like he says something like, your ego is prego, and she goes, silencio, old man. Just like the way that they're talking is like very unrealistic but very fun. It kind of reminded me a little bit of Napoleon Dynamite, just kind of this like
Yeah.
weird kind of silly dialogue that I absolutely love. um I'm wondering, like, if you could choose a scene that defined this movie for you, what would that scene be?
Hmm. I think probably the scene where Juno goes to get the ultrasound, and she's accompanied by Brenda, who's Allison Janney's character, her stepmother, and her friend Olivia, and the ultrasound tech, who's very clearly judging Juno for being pregnant at her age. Um, and you've got a lot of the kind of the wisecracking, the humor that goes back and forth between Juno and her two support people that are there with her. And then when she makes mention of Mark and Vanessa that she is planning to place the baby for adoption, and the ultrasound tech is kind of like, well, thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
And Brenda really pounces on her and is very fiercely defensive of Juno, in a way that is funny. And Olivia kind of jokes, like, I think Brenda says, well, what if they're abusive? And Vanessa or uh, Leah, her friend character, who played by Olivia Trilby, says, or what if they're stage parents or something,
Right.
like that.
Right.
And it's funny,
Dance moms.
but then they're very, it's this show of solidarity around Juno that actually suggests that even though they are supportive of the adoption in a fundamental way, they're also defensive and protective of her. And I really liked that moment, and I think it was a moment that captures something that is in fact really real, which is the stigma that a lot of these young mothers face. And to have her people around her validating her motherhood. And it's one of the only scenes in the movie where adoption isn't immediately at face value accepted as the entirely necessary solution to what's happening to Juno. And I think that was really validating too.
Absolutely. I love that scene so much. I think that it really shows, like you said, how protective her community is over her, and the fact that kind of what you were saying in the beginning of the episode of like, oh, it's so like, you know, you're so worthy, and you're like, thank goodness, because you clearly as a teenager have no idea what you're doing, and like, I'm offended as this ultrasound tech that you would even potentially be keeping the baby. And like, what a relief it is to me. And I just love how Brenda is like, I'm a nail technician, so how about I stick to my job and you stick to yours? Basically, like,
Yeah.
shut up. Like, you have no business kind of judging my stepdaughter. And it is very funny, but done in a way that feels like, oh wow, like Juno it is like worthy of being protected, and like we as the audience see that by how fierce like her community is to protect her.
And Juno faces a lot of judgment, right? And it's done in a sometimes in a blatant way, but sometimes in a subtle way where you'll just sort of see her talking with someone at the school, and they're kind of staring at her pregnant belly,
Yeah.
and kind of looking sideways, or the moments where other students are kind of giving her a side eye. And I think that is real. So when I think about Juno's experience compared to a lot of the mothers that I have interviewed and that I have worked with around their adoption, that stigma is real for them. For a lot of them, the attention that the pregnancy brings onto them, they're very familiar with that feeling. And I think
Yeah.
that comes through and that judgment that she feels really subjected to in her community. And so the fact that she doesn't really get that from the people who love her, I think is really meaningful about this movie. Her friend, boyfriend, Polly,
Hmm.
they have an interesting relationship over the course of the film, kind of where they are, whether they're friends, whether they're a couple. But he never judges her. He's always supportive of her. Her friend Leah assumes she's going to get an abortion. It seems like Juno assumes she's going to get an abortion at the beginning, but kind of immediately pivots when Juno says that that's not what she wants and is supportive of the adoption decision. And her parents are as well, her father and her stepmother, kind of in their own way. They're not happy she's pregnant. They're really uncomfortable with the idea that she's pregnant. Her father has one line right after she tells him that she's pregnant. Like, I thought you were the kind of girl who knew how to say when.
Yeah.
Um, and and you see that hits Juno hard. And she says,
Yeah.
I'm not sure I know what kind of girl I am, Dad.
Ugh.
And that hits you, and Brenda kind of immediately course corrects, right? And is like, yep, this sucks, but we're going to support her. We're going to get her prenatal vitamins. We're going to, you're going to go meet with her with the lawyer. And other than that one moment, which I don't want to dismiss, I think that sometimes it just takes that one moment that can really shape the options that people feel are available to them. But other than that one moment, the people that Juno is closest to are there for her. And I do still like that about the movie.
100%. I feel like the way that the dad, played by J.K. Simmons, who I fucking love, great actor, like it feels realistic. Like it doesn't feel necessarily like, an over exaggeration of like how a dad would react if he found out his 16-year-old daughter were pregnant. Like shock, disappointment, and in the end, like definitely full 100% support and love. And I think like that does show the range of human emotions that is realistic for people to feel when they hear news like that. And then the last thing I want to say before we move on, to Paulie, is like the reason why I love Paulie's character played by Michael Cera so much is because in rom-com vom in general, usually the male protagonist, the male love interest, is like utter trash. And usually there's some really, really unhealthy power imbalances and dynamics, and there's stalking and there's fat phobia and there's racism, and like none of that exists in this film. Like Paulie is ultimately, like, if we're going to talk about a power dynamic, kind of consistently like kind of not chasing Juno, but like kind of pining after her a little bit. And he kind of makes these little comments towards her throughout the movie of like, oh, like in his soft spoken way, like, we could get back together too, or, whatever you want. Like we see a shot of him holding her underwear. Like he clearly is in love with her, and he very much like is respectful of her and non-judgmental. And, she mentions in the beginning that she might want to, quote unquote, take care of it, aka get an abortion. He says, if that's what you want to do, then that's what like every step of the way, he is the ultimate kind of indie boy cutie. And I just really like that the way that he is written by Diablo Cody. I just think that it's such a unique and different perspective than the other male protagonists we get in rom-coms of this era.
Well, one thing I like about how both he and Juno are portrayed is that there are still so many things that are kind of like little kid about them, right? Like when you see the shot of him holding her underwear, but like in a race car bed,
Right.
right? Or like how Juno kind of has that like weird hamburger phone as she's like calling to make the appointment for her abortion, and kind of has these posters on the wall. And um, I think those moments really get at how young they are. And
Yes.
this weird moment of 16 as being, to use the phrase Juno hates, rather than sexually active, right? But
Right.
still being a young kid in so many ways. And I think that that becomes important to her storyline with Mark later as things evolve.
Mm.
Because so many movies, especially like rom-coms about high schoolers, make them just adults that are, still in high school, but don't give any of that childness to them. I don't want to say
Yes.
childishness because it's not an immaturity, it's an appropriate level of maturity. And I think
They
that
are
that is
children.
also, they are children in so many ways. And I think that that's not something that I've seen in a lot of other films and that I continue to appreciate about Juno.
Agreed. Totally agreed. We're going to move on to the main kind of segment of this show, which is called That's Problematic, where we go over a few themes in general and kind of discuss and decipher like what kind of is problematic about this and maybe how could it have been better. And so I think like the first major theme that we'll talk about is just how adoption is framed in general in Juno. I think like a few things like adoption is kind of presented as quote unquote an easy choice for her, which is, as you very well know, like in stark contrast to the way that real life birth mothers and parents experience adoption. Another piece of this is like Vanessa and Mark as the perfect couple, which later we learn like they're not so perfect. They're not very happy together, actually. And I wonder like what it actually looks like in real life for couples and their reality who are, adopting a baby. And then kind of what you mentioned before, which is like teen parents can't really succeed or shouldn't even try at that. So what thread do you want to
Yeah.
pull? What?
Well, let's start with Mark and Vanessa, I think, because I think that that's actually where the film is most right about adoption. So the
Mm,
things that it gets right are that adoption is almost always the transfer of babies from poorer families and parents to more affluent families. Um, and I think that you see that the class difference between Mark and Vanessa in their suburban, very beautifully decorated home, as opposed to Juno's very working class family and her home, and kind of the ways that she is immediately out of place. Not out of place in that she's kind of excluded from, but just that it's very much a fish out of water scenario when she's there. You can see how different she is from them. And you can see even her father, when her father comes to Mark and Vanessa's home to meet with the lawyer the first time. And he's like, "What is that?" And Vanessa's like, "That's a Pilates machine." He goes, "Oh, what do you make
right.
with that?" Right. Like
Yes.
these are kind of all these signifiers of the class difference, the socioeconomic difference between where Juno is coming from and where Mark and Vanessa are. And I think that that is really, that is correct. That is something that happens in adoption all the time. And the extent to which a lot of the mothers I spoke with kind of got starstruck by their child's adoptive parents, especially during the pre-birth matching phase, because of their privilege, because whatever was bringing them to the adoption, right? Lack of money and other resources, lack of support, usually for girls who were young, like Juno, the fact that their own parents weren't supportive of them parenting to a far harsher degree than Juno goes through. They turn to the adoptive parents. And for a lot of them, that was the aspiration, right? This
Mhm.
sort of married middle class affluent stability, that was what they wanted, not just for their child but for themselves. And so a lot of that, when Juno kind of talks about like, "Oh, I kind of want this like graphic designer with a cool Asian girlfriend who like plays the bass
Right.
guitar, but I don't want to be too picky," right? Like you have, the way that a lot of the mothers that I interviewed talked about their child's adoptive parents, like, "Oh, the mom is a fashion designer and the dad is a news broadcaster," and just this idea of them as kind of larger than life, better than life, picture perfect. Um, that is true. And I think that the film actually captured that in a really interesting way. And the way that Mark kind of becomes the person that Juno connects with the most, isn't, is, I think that the way that Mark and Juno's relationship develops is not typical, but kind of her like girlish infatuation with him, and
Yeah.
looking for points of connection with him, I think is real in some ways.
Mhm.
Um, and of course he makes it weird, right? I don't want to act like that is the norm, but I think that like her working to find an adult that she can connect with in a substantive way is real, and seeing that in her child's prospective adoptive father is not unusual.
Mhm.
Um, or with Vanessa, right? I think that her relationship with Vanessa is really different than her relationship with Mark, but she definitely sees her something aspirational in how beautiful she is, right? How professional, how polished she is, um,
Her
in her
perfume and, like,
preparedness. Yeah,
her
exactly,
bathroom.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's real. So I think that the film gets that dynamic right in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. Um, and I also think that it captures a lot of small moments around Vanessa, and they don't even comment on Vanessa and Mark's inability to conceive beyond the fact that they
Mm.
wanted to have a child for many years. Um, but there are a few moments where, Juno makes a joke about how being pregnant sucks. And Vanessa says, I think being pregnant is beautiful. And Juno says, well, you're lucky you don't have to go through it. And Vanessa kind of
At
has
least it's not you.
this
Yeah.
moment where you can tell that that's been that strikes her, right? Because she's obviously someone who very, very desperately wants to be pregnant.
Mhm.
And I think that is, you can see that that's real. And the tension that their inability to conceive has created in their marriage over time is real. Their disagreement over when and whether to paint the baby's room,
Right.
how much stuff to buy, what they can expect of their friends, the fact that they don't think their friends are going to throw them a baby shower because they've kind of had a failed adoption before that they just kind of mention in passing. I think all of that stress on a relationship and on people is real.
Mhm.
And I think that the film does a good job of capturing that. So those are the things I think it gets right around this.
Yes.
I think it gets everything about Juno's pregnancy decision wrong. Nothing about how Juno thinks about her pregnancy, thinks about the options that are available to her throughout her pregnancy, reflect really any of the mothers that I interviewed in my
Tell
research
me
in
more.
any fundamental way. So most mothers that relinquish infants for adoption don't try to have an abortion. Most mothers who relinquish infants continue their pregnancies because they want to parent. And what we found is that this is true for women who have abortions and women who relinquish for adoption. So they're always choosing between parenting and something else. So this is true even of women who are denied access to abortion. When you deny people access to abortion, 91% of those women who give birth as a result of abortion denial are going to be parenting. So even when you take away the option of abortion, most women are parenting. And when you look at the mothers who relinquish, very few of them tried to have an abortion. And if they hadn't relinquished, they would be parenting their children. And so almost none of the women that I interviewed were choosing between adoption and abortion at one point in their pregnancy. So if abortion is off the table because they can't access one, they can't afford one, it's illegal, they're past the gestational limit at which they can pursue one, all of that, they'll turn to adoption in different ways. But adoption kind of is the last case scenario. It's what happens when nothing else feels possible,
Mm.
because you can't afford to parent, you don't have support around parenting, or you can't access abortion. And so I think that the way that Juno moves very quickly and doesn't think deeply about whether or not she wants to have an abortion, but is clearly uncomfortable at the clinic that she goes to, um, that is not what we know about women who go to get abortions either, right? People who go to get abortions have been planning on getting an abortion since they got their positive pregnancy test. They're very sure of their decision. They have very low levels of regret after their abortion decision and for years thereafter. Juno didn't put a lot of thought into whether or not she wanted to have an abortion, which I think is fine. I don't think that an abortion needs to be a fraught decision. I don't think for a lot of people who get abortions that it is a fraught decision. And kind of the assumption was, well, you're 16, if you're pregnant, you get an abortion, and that's fine. I don't know why it had to be kind of this like viscerally uncomfortable experience for her to be there, except that I think that she didn't really want to have an abortion in the first place, which is fine. And I wish that it had been framed a little differently. I wish that the clinic could have been a place where she actually felt really supported to have an abortion or not have an abortion, and to have more of a conversation about what those choices could be. That's what I would hope that a lot of pregnant people who are in a vulnerable place or a confused place would get at their clinics. It's not always, but I think so. I think that was interesting. I don't love that depiction, but I don't
of her in the abortion clinic.
Yeah, but I think that if the way I have always understood that scene is Juno doesn't really want to have an abortion. And so if you don't want to have an abortion and you're
the right thing to do,
she just thinks it's
unquote.
what you do. Yeah. And if you're in an abortion clinic about to have an abortion and you don't really want to have one, then that's a pretty uncomfortable place to be. And so I have always interpreted that, like, her kind of discomfort in that space as something that's real, which is that she just doesn't really want to be there. And I kind of wish it had been framed that way rather than like the space, the woman at the front desk kind of like playing her video game when she walks in and being really indifferent and like offering her the flavored condoms and like kind of everyone picking at their nails in this really uncomfortable way and having, like I wish that it had been a different place where she found support for the complexity of what she was feeling rather than this kind of deeply uncomfortable place. But that's fine, right? Like everybody's going to have their different interpretation there. And I can kind of move past that. The fact that she turns immediately to adoption after that, I think is the most unrealistic part. And when you look at the gestational age at which most mothers who end up relinquishing reach out to agencies or sort of take proactive steps toward making an adoption happen, more of them are at or after birth than are in their first or second trimester combined. So this is usually actions that are taken very much towards the end of pregnancy or right at delivery or within a few weeks of the baby's birth. So the question of like whether this has anything to do with it has nothing to do with abortion, right? They're well past the point at which they're going to consider abortion. I mean, in more cases, the baby is born than that they can still legally access an abortion. And so I think that that's an important distinction, is that these mothers, they're not waiting because they are just putting this off. They are continuing their pregnancies with the intention of raising their children. And it's not until something happens later in the pregnancy that makes parenting feel really impossible that they turn to adoption. And I think that that is a really important difference. So the idea that a young girl right in her first trimester, right at the end of her first trimester, is taking proactive steps to make an adoption happen is not realistic, both when you look at the stories, the women that I interviewed, and when you look at the demographic data or when people are reaching out to agencies and attorneys. Wow. So once women decide not to have an abortion for whatever reason, that would have been the time for Juno to be like, well, now what the hell am I going to do? Right. And to have those conversations with her parents about like, what would this mean to parent? Is this something that I'm really like that grapple? That's would have been more realistic. Not storytellers are telling a story, but that is what, and I don't expect all stories to be realistic, but that is what is incredibly unrealistic. The fact that she just immediately pivots to adoption as the solution.
Let's talk about vacation sex. If you're like me, I bet you want a little pleasure while you're away, but can't fit your entire sex toy collection in your carry-on, huh? Say hello to the brand new Magic Wand Micro. Born into such a famous family, this little wand has quite a reputation to uphold while fitting in the palm of your hand. Same magic, now in pocket size. Use code SEXEDWITHDB at Lion's Den for 15% off your Magic Wand Micro now. Ever since getting married to my wonderful husband, I've been thinking about ways to keep things fun and novel between us. But I, of course, want it to feel organic. I want to be able to feel sexy and comfortable in my body while trying something new. Thanks to Lion's Den, a new adventure I've been exploring is the world of lingerie. I never really was a big lingerie girl myself, but once I started trying on lingerie that accentuated my curves, felt super soft to the touch, and made me look in the mirror and feel wildly confident in my skin, that changed pretty quickly. Plus, when I searched for what I might like on Lion's Den's website, I saw models that actually looked like me. They were curvy and thick and voluptuous, and it made all the difference to see models that have my body type. Want to join me in my new lingerie chapter? Right now, you can use code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off your purchase in-store and online at lionsden.com. Follow them on social media at Lions Den Adult on Instagram and TikTok for exclusive offers, deals, and giveaways. Valentine's Day is around the corner, and you haven't shopped for your boo yet. I'd love to introduce you to Aria, a service for couples that makes it easy to break out of routine, deepen emotional connection, and energize their relationship with curated experiences called scenes. And let me tell you, they are hot as hell. Woo! Plus, hand-picked premium items delivered discreetly to your door. If you want to gift your boo something that's actually a secret gift to yourself, get a Valentine's Day gift card to Aria at arya.fyi and use code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off now.
I have more complicated. I've always had complicated feelings about this movie because, again, I do think that it is charming in the same way that like fairy tales are charming, right? But I think also that the regressive things at the root of fairy tales about like damsels in distress and like princes rescuing, like I think that those things are really regressive narratives too. But I can still enjoy them, right?
Completely.
And I think that is. I think that's where I am about this film, where the fairy tale of it is cute. But, and if we had a lot of other stories about adoption that were more realistic, then I think that I would be like, well, this is fine. It's wrong, but like, it's a cute, funny story. But the fact that this film is the extent to which a lot of viewers are going to be thinking about adoption and how mothers are making their pregnancy decisions. And to think it's quite easy to just kind of make this choice and move on with it in your life. That I think is really, really regressive and very conservative in ways that are really troubling. And I should say, I asked all of the mothers that I interviewed. I interviewed over 100 mothers who relinquished embryoes for adoption. And I always ask them, like, what stories do you see in our culture, our pop culture, about adoption that you feel strongly about, either that you really like or that you identify with or that you dislike? And they all like uniformly hated Juno, right?
Ooh,
like if an interview was going slowly, like bringing up Juno was one way to like kick it into gear again, you know?
Yes.
Because it was so anathema to their experience. It was so at odds with what they had gone through in their pregnancy. And I think that there were things that were offensive to them. So when Juno talks about just, close her up, like have a traditional closed adoption, right? And I don't believe that mothers, there are rare cases where a mother will pursue a closed adoption, usually for the child's safety. So if they're in a severe domestic violence situation, and they want to have a closed adoption so that the child's father cannot reach out to them or whatever. But even then, and I've spoken with mothers who were in that scenario who were like, this adoption had to be closed. But 4 years later, when I was no longer in that relationship and I was in a place of greater safety, I wanted to be able to reach out. So over 95% of adoptions today are open to some degree.
Wow.
That can mean a tremendous range of things. It can mean that a mother is getting pictures that the adoptive family sends to the agency, which sends to her, twice a year for a couple of years. That could be considered an open adoption. I've also, at the other end of the spectrum, interviewed mothers who are like babysitting their own children for the adoptive parents or going on family vacations with them. So you have this huge range of level of contact, level of knowledge, level of connection. And many of the mothers that I interviewed were not happy with the amount of contact that they have with their children. They had within that huge range, all of them wanted knowledge of their child. All of them wanted that point of connection. They couldn't always deliver on it from their end. They didn't always want it on the terms that were being offered to them by the adoptive family. But they all wanted that. They all wanted to have some ongoing connection to their child. And so the idea that Juno would just be like, no, I'm good. You just take him. I'll just, send him off down the river for you.
Right.
That was utterly foreign to them. And I think if you talk, I don't study adopted people, but I've been in community with a conversation with a lot of them in the course of this research. Adoptees are the people who benefit the most from having an open adoption, from having contact with their birth parents, their family of origin. And so this idea that openness is just a favor that we do for birth parents rather than something that really centers an adopted child and what they need and the type of relationships that they need as they grow, that I think was really upsetting to a lot of the mothers that I interviewed, because ending that contact completely, severing that completely, is a disservice to the child as they grow. And I think that there's nothing about Juno that is about what her son needs at all, honestly. There's the presumption that giving him to a middle-class family is what's best in the long run. But there's nothing about what he's going to need from Juno as he grows.
Wow. I am learning so much, Gretchen. I really appreciate all of this detail about your research. As you all know, we'll get into this a little bit more in Friday's bonus episode, but I want to get back to a couple other key things before we let you go. Predominantly, I want to start in the cringe corner right now, which is like a moment or like something about the movie that feels very cringy. And I want to, for a second here, get into Juno's relationship with Mark, because as I was kind of talking about this with a friend, kind of sharing that you were going to be on this podcast, she kind of aptly mentioned that she thought, and she's a sex ed teacher for middle and high school students, and she aptly mentioned, like, I think this is a really like accurate depiction of what it could look like for an adult to be grooming a child. And I didn't even kind of frame it like that in my mind, but I think that she is right. Like throughout the film, we see Mark kind of have this inappropriate relationship with Juno where they're talking to each other during the school day. They're sharing music. They are flirting. They are joking around. And my major piece in the cringe corner is when they start to dance and they're kind of talking about his high school prom. He's clearly like in his 30s or 40s, and she is 16, and he puts his hands like on her waist, on her belly, next to her belly. And it just feels like this very uncomfortable moment for any women or queer people who are watching this who have ever felt like an older person has been inappropriate with you. It just really like hits. And I'm wondering if you can like speak to this a little bit, if you have this in your cringe corner, or if there's another cringe corner piece.
Yeah. Well, I think, and actually what's interesting is that whenever Juno goes over to Vanessa and Mark's house, it's after someone has disappointed her or judged her, right? So after that ultrasound tech is judgmental and harsh to her, even though her mother and her friend are kind of around her and protective of her, that's when she seeks out going to see Mark, right? Or after she gets in a fight with Polly Bleecker about going to prom, that's when she goes to visit Mark, and they're talking about his prom and that kind of that awkward dance moment. So this is when she's feeling vulnerable and she wants to connect with an adult that's clearly interested in what she has to say, shares some interests, right? And so in that way, I think the grooming is spot on. What I think is another kind of curious part of the film is there's always this implied flirtation between Leah, her friend Leah, and their teacher, one of their teachers. Right. And what I can never understand is this just a joke that Juno and Leah have that is kind of running, but like nothing's really happening there? Is there actually something inappropriate about Leah's relationship with this teacher?
Right.
I don't know. Right. But there's kind of this implied world that exists where you have these inappropriate relationships. And Juno is still kind of turning to Mark for support. And I think the grooming is spot on a way of understanding that relationship and the impropriety of it. So I think that's a huge cringe moment. I mean, like I have other cringe moments that are probably more benign, like when Vanessa is kind of putting her hands on Juno's bare belly and like talking to the baby. Like as someone who's been pregnant a bunch of times, like I would have rather sunk through the floor than ever have anyone do that.
Ah,
You know, so like that's very cringy to me. But I think that that's just me personally rather than like feminist me. And
still
so
fair.
I think, yeah, I think that there are plenty, but I also think that it makes tangible Vanessa's like longing and desperation for a baby. That is
Desperation.
really
Yes.
probably not inaccurate. Like a lot of prospective adoptive parents are quite desperate. And you see that when she asks Juno if she wants any other compensation other than coverage for her medical expenses. Um, and Juno's father's like, well, what do you mean? And she just sort of like lays it out there. That's illegal. I mean, you're not allowed to buy a baby. A lot of adoption agencies will walk
Right.
right up to that line. Um, but that's how that character is introduced, is sort of this like palpable desperation for a child. I think that that's uncomfortable for me in a different way than the grooming mark behavior, but also kind of cringy.
Completely. Yes. Yes. Okay, Gretchen, we're towards the end of our episode today. We have a segment where we rewrite like a character or a piece of the film in order for it to more accurately depict kind of what we're seeking. You kind of mentioned earlier, potentially, Juno would be seeking this adoption later on after maybe at the birth or afterwards. Like, would that be the thing that you rewrite, or would it be something different?
It's a little bit futile just to be like, oh, I would have changed this because I would have changed the entire story
Right.
arc,
The integrity
really.
of it. Sure.
And I don't know. I think that there were a couple of moments that could have made a real difference. Where you see at the end where she's crying, right? And you see that moment of her grief that was so definitive of the experience of so many other mothers who have given up their children, or where Polly doesn't want to see the baby because the idea makes him too sad. I wish that you had given a little bit of a window into that loss and what that
Hmm.
means, because for for those parents who've actually gone through this, that grief, that mourning is what's definitive about them. That's not a happy ending, though. They wanted to have the happy ending of her riding her bike and them playing the guitar together. And I get that. So I don't know how you do that within the course of the film without changing completely the story that you're telling. But I do wish that that had been there, or that they had shown some desire for Juno to have an ongoing relationship with her child, or for Polly to want to see the baby. Um, I wish they had grappled with the emotion of that a little bit more.
Totally. Yeah. Maybe some more scenes of like her chatting with Leah and just kind of just being like calling each other on their hamburger phones, just being like, "Hey, I'm just like feeling sad about this." And like I just wanted to share that with somebody. Like that could have made a little bit of a difference.
Yeah. I think the reason why I really have a hard time with this film is that the idea that adoption is a solution, and an easy solution, is one that is constantly advanced by the United States Supreme Court, members of Congress, the state of Texas, right? The state of Texas will do almost anything rather than give people access to abortions or like actually support vulnerable families. So they're putting millions of dollars into advertising adoption in Black and brown neighborhoods across Texas. I think we're going to see more of this. This is in Project 2025, is promoting adoption. And so that's where I get it up to like the 5 bomb or the 4 bomb level, right?
Mhm.
Because this contributes directly to this idea that adoption is easy in the lives of women, that it doesn't reflect this fundamental social failure to give people reproductive autonomy and to give them control over their life circumstances. And that is what really gets to me, is that it is communicating all of these ideas that are underlying this really regressive propaganda that I think we're going to start seeing more and more of. And in that way, to me, is a fundamentally unfeminist movie.
Hmm. I really, really appreciate that. I really value all of your expertise and your point of view. You are the perfect person to have on for this episode. So I'm so glad that you are here. Before I let you go and say goodbye, I'm going to share next week's trivia teaser. Coming up next week, a special Rom-Com Vom episode where we review a very exciting new rom-com release that's actually coming out in 2025. So stay tuned for that. If you have a rom-com that you remember from growing up, submit it to us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and leaving a comment on Spotify. And yeah, Gretchen has done hundreds of interviews with mothers who have relinquished their babies for adoption. I am so excited to learn more from you, Gretchen, for our Friday episode. So folks, make sure that you tune into that. Gretchen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Our creator, host, and executive producer is me, Danielle Bezalel, aka DB. Our producer is Sadie Lidji. Our communications lead is Cathren Cohen. Our marketing coordinator is Alex Bateman. Our music theme is by Hook Sounds. Thanks so much to our featured guests, partners, and listeners. If you have a rom-com you remember from growing up and want us to cover it on Rom-Com Bomb, submit it to us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and leaving a comment on Spotify. Want to partner with us? Email us at sexedwithdb@gmail.com. For more sex ed content, follow us on Instagram @sexedwithdbpodcast. See you next time.